Hello, Dr. Cooper. We are ready to go. I cannot hear you. You're muted.
Now, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right. And so, shall I go ahead and start with our announcement?
Yes.
Okay, great. Welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. This is Sharon Cooper, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, there are a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on Floor on the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on Documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. There will be a Q&A during the last 5 minutes of the webinar. To submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging and then Participants, and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. We will now begin our discussion. It is really a pleasure for me to speak to you today about a concept, this concept of the normalization of sexual harm. Our children are growing up in a highly sexualized society, and being able to see what is good for them and what is harmful for them is truly a challenge. I'm a developmental and forensic pediatrician, and I've spent the last 40 years working with children who have any type of developmental problem and children who have been victims of crime. Today, we're going to review the research on the sexualization of girls. We're going to talk about online risk-taking behavior, which may be unrecognized as a source of subsequent dangerous online enticement. We're going to learn of campaigns that are actively reaching out to teenagers in an effort to promote healthy relationships. And we will learn of recent brain studies which make children and youth much more vulnerable to risk-taking behaviors, which may result in self-incrimination and or criminal charges. So let's talk about the word normalization. It means to conform to or reduce to a norm or a standard. And within the context of this discussion, sexual harm becomes normal. Sexual harm can become normalized in several circumstances. When the harm is sexual, the impact is likely to become more long-lasting as compared to a bullying situation that has no sexual overtones. In Ontario, there was recently an article that was talking about children being highly stressed by the virtual learning environment. And we know that this is happening worldwide because of COVID-19. But there's also a risk for harm because of the issue of confinement in homes, where we are now recognizing more sexual abuse and or exploitation not only may be occurring, but is occurring because of greater access to children who are not able to leave their homes and be safe in a school setting. What is an additional factor during the COVID-19 pandemic is the fact that teachers are your most frequent reporters of child maltreatment, and looking virtually through a screen at your students in that manner is a real barrier to safekeeping. So therefore, our students over this last year and probably a good portion of this year have gone from pen to paper and teacher to face to digital interactions. And these digital interactions can just have a lot more impact upon their overall understanding of things and being able to just determine when there is a risk for them. Which child will be safe from any form of child abuse, but especially sexual harm? We know that children who have disabilities, learning disabilities, autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, any of speech and language delay, any of these kinds of differences in learning make them at higher risk to be sexually harmed. In fact, the research has shown that if a patient has a disability, they are 2 times more likely in their lifespan to become a victim of sexual assault. And so when parents feel that it's fine for their children to be able to not just get online in a school setting, but to just get online in general, no one's going to bother their child because they're only 6 years old. They are fooling themselves. I have most assuredly seen patients of mine who were as young as 5, 6, and 7 be groomed through an individual in their favorite video games, particularly Minecraft and Roblox, where you have massively multiplayer online role playing. And so parents need to be prepared to put into place some type of protection or be present when their children are in cyberspace. So, how did we get here in the first place, this concern for the normalization of sexual harm? Well, in the center of this image is a statement that says, well intended parents, immigrants in cyberspace. That is how we have been. We were the immigrants in cyberspace. That's changing to some degree because a lot of our parents now are much more tech savvy, but their children are not immigrants. They are the natives in cyberspace. They were born into cyber technology. They have an understanding of media and technology that far surpasses most kids who don't have access to technology as they do in our countries. And this brings us to the whole challenge of mirror neuron research. If you can see the little image at the bottom where there's a person sitting in a chair, the person sitting in the chair is looking at a sexualized scene on a screen, and in his or her mind, he's thinking of himself being in that scene. Because what mirror neurons do is that they convince us that what we are seeing, we are experiencing. I'll explain that a little bit better in a second. There have been more and more documents written now about the impact of pornography on children, youth, and culture. And pornography addiction has become a very significant problem because it is so easily accessed, particularly in cyberspace. I have now participated in 3 congressional briefings regarding the availability of adult pornography on the internet and why it is not a good thing for socialization and why it is a problem specifically for youth. Part of it is because of brain maturity. This image reflects research by Gotag et al. And was done in the year 2000. Each of these brains that go from 5 years up to 20 years of age by functional MRI studies reveal that the brain is maturing from the back of the brain forward. The blue color indicates maturity of the brain. And so the occipital region of the brain is the first part that starts to become mature. And the last part is going to be right here in the frontal cortex where our forehead is. This is the part of the brain where good judgment, impulse control, and thinking about consequences exist. And this research now has helped us to understand why we should be more mindful of 16, 17, and 18-year-olds whom we gauge in many countries as being adults by the age of 18, but whose brains are not going to be completely mature until they're 26 years of age. So this mirror neuron research, this research began in 2007, and the first papers that were written about mirror neurons came out of Italy. And what they helped us to recognize is that the mirror neurons in our brain convince us that what we are seeing, we are actually experiencing. At first, we thought vision was from the eyes through the optic nerves, crossing over in the middle of the brain and going to the very back of the brain where the optic radiations are concerned. We thought that's what vision was. We did not realize that vision was more than just seeing. What we now know in this particular image is that the temporal lobe in green and the parietal lobe in that sort of deep pink color, as well as the prefrontal cortex in purple, are all involved in the process of understanding what we see. So, therefore, if we were all sitting right now in a movie theater and a car chase was on the screen and it was going really fast and the filmographers were making the scene as if they were in the car, we were in the car with them, and we're seeing things flashing by from the film, a significant percentage of us watching that film would start leaning forward. Our eyes would get a little larger. Our hands might kind of clench into fists. We would quickly begin to believe we were experiencing what we were seeing. And if all of a sudden and unexpectedly there was a car crash in the film, a significant percentage of people in a theater would gasp because they were not expecting there to be a car crash, because their brains had convinced them that what they were seeing, they were experiencing. Hold on to that concept because it's very relevant to the problem of looking at internet pornography. When we become convinced that we're experiencing what we're seeing. In 2007, the American Psychological Association published a task force report that was updated in 2010. And it was talking about the sexualization of girls. And this particular report was really helpful because by that time, we were beginning to see very young girls, toddlers, and preschoolers who were being dressed and were on television and other sites acting as if they were grown women. And not just acting as if they were grown women, because toddlers and preschoolers forever used to dress up in their mom's clothes and put on their little high heels and walk around like they're grown women. But these were children who were dressed as if they were adult women and in a very sexualized fashion. We began to see it in Halloween costumes. We began to see it on television programs. And what the APA said was, when you sexualize girls, you begin to teach them that their primary value is in their sexuality, not in their school performance, not in their athletic talents, not in their musical capabilities. None of those things are as important as being sexy. And the APA report went on to say that when that becomes the belief system of children and sometimes their parents as well, they begin to see themselves as objects, not as people. If I'm not a sexy object, I'm not going to be okay. So the term sexual objectification was first given to us by the American Psychological Association to help us understand why the mirror neuron research and trends in adultifying children, that's another term that's now in the literature, making children think, act, look, and appear as if they are little adults. This is all a dynamic that's associated with the normalization of sexual harm, because the thing about children is that their maturation is going to be sexual as the most obvious form of maturity. So in the APA study, 300 studies were reviewed, and they distinguish sexualization from healthy sexuality. The latter, healthy sexuality, is an important component of both physical and mental health. It fosters intimacy, bonding, and shared pleasure, and it involves mutual respect between consenting partners. That's what healthy sexuality is. However, with sexualization, person's values come only from their sexual appeal or behavior. They're held to a standard that equates physical attractiveness as being sexy, and the person is sexually objectified, made into a thing for others' sexual use, rather than seen as a person with the capacity for independent action and decision making. Sexuality is inappropriately imposed upon a person. Now, this is done in clothing, it's done in literature, it's done in plays, in movies, in music videos, and it's done in fashion. Many books now have been written about the sexualization of childhood. And when we think about the sexualization of childhood, the primary type of child who's being sexualized are girls as compared to boys. Yes, there were plenty of advertisements for clothing that were associated with respect to making boys look highly sexualized, but the real part is the sexualization of girls and the sexualization of childhood. This particular book was edited by Sharon, and she writes, and many others did as well, about this dynamic of the sexualization of childhood and why we need to push back on that because the industry, the fashion industry, tries very hard to really make our children grow up before they're really ready to be grown. The UK put out a similar report to the APA report called Letting Children Be Children. And it was a report of an independent review of the commercialization and sexualization of childhood within the context of fashion, tennis shoes, sports, every way to commercialize childhood. And by commercializing it, they were also sexualizing it. So the problem with the sexualization of children is that they're two very sexually unhealthy messages, which are in fact being marketed to society. One is that of inclusive of children, youth, and adults, that children should be seen as desirable sexual objects. Let's stop right there. When children should be seen as desired sexual objects, this can cause individuals who have a preferential interest in children to rationalize to themselves, well, look at how she looks. It seems to me that she's ripe for the picking. These are some of the cognitive distortions that we hear from offenders who ultimately commit sexual crimes against children. We also know that when children are sexualized, they are at higher risk to participate in sexually risky behaviors, such as earlier onset of sexual intercourse, earlier onset of drinking and smoking. Definitely dynamics that we want children to be able to delay if at all possible. That highly sexualized adult woman who is made to look like a child in in the commercial world communicates the message that children are fair game for sexual exploitation. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute, but I want to also make it very clear that when children feel that their only value is in their sexuality and they begin to have interpersonal relationships with peers or older children, they are at higher risk for teen dating violence. They're at higher risk for being involved in alcohol use, smoking, and they're also at higher risk for having a sexually transmitted disease. This is research that has also already been done that helps us to recognize that if you sexualize children, you will bring to them something that they are not yet cognitively ready for and whose parents aren't even really prepared to be talking about. And this is within the whole context of the challenge of the earlier onset of puberty in children. I'll talk about that in a minute. In 2006, there was an organization, the Australia Institute, that published a document called Corporate Pedophilia, the Sexualization of Children in Australia. There was an attempted lawsuit against them after they published this particular treatise. But the reason that they published it was because they were talking about how adults were being made to look like children in highly sexually explicit ways. So let me show you some of the advertisements that they were in particularly talking about. And this particular company was Lee Jeans Australia. Here in Lee Jeans Australia, you have an adult woman who's made to look like a child at the top of your screen. She is modeling the little jeans with the suspenders. She's topless. She has on knee highs and she's licking a lollipop. In the advertisement, this is the actual advertisement itself. In the back of that advertisement, you can see there is a man who doesn't have a shirt on who is taking pictures of her. That's the bright light. Um, the whole concept of the juicy line, you probably remember those, where all the clothes had the word juicy on the back over the buttocks. That's a really significant statement to put across a child's butt or an adult's butt for that matter. Further advertisements by this particular jeans company included age compression, the young boy and young woman made to look like a younger teenager at the top of the screen are individuals who are adults made to look like teenagers. The same is true with the middle screen, but I think the most compelling were the two bottom pictures, the one where the young boy who is actually an adult male and the young girl who is actually an adult female are making out, if you will, on a couch. And the next scene that you see is the older man with a camera with a girl, supposedly like a teenager, topless, in a bed with satin sheets. And remember, he has a camera. This kind of advertising, which was happening in Australia for blue jeans, was what the researchers felt was necessary for them to speak about. And that terminology, corporate pedophilia, became a term worldwide for us to recognize how there can be a normalization of sexual harm. Many of the unhealthy messages regarding relationships are usually of sexual harm. So that prefrontal cortex, which is not yet mature, is not yet ready to deal with some of the challenges that we see. What you see is what gets you. This is a quote by um, Iman El Amin, who is the leader of a Black Muslim mosque in Baltimore, Maryland. I met Iman El Amin at a listening session sponsored by our Attorney General here in the United States, which lasted for almost a year and a half as a group of a task force for which I was a member traveled around the United States talking about children exposed to violence. And what Iman El Amin was saying was that when he talked to the young boys in his mosque, he was saying to them, it used to be that we would say, what you see is what you get. But he said to our task force, we have had to change that because now what we say to our young boys is what you see is what gets you. And I felt that that was one of the most poignant and truthful statements that we should all remember. Porn destroys. Many teenagers never learn what a healthy relationship is because adult pornography starts teaching them its version, which is typically filled with domination, infidelity, abuse, and violence. The ease of access of adult pornography today on the internet is sobering, truly sobering, because if for no other reason, that all a child has to do is type in maybe just 3 letters, POR. They don't even have to get to the end. The whole first page of Google will all be not only free adult pornography sites, but they will be free video adult pornography sites. And what we know from research with respect to functional MRI studies and other brain studies is that when we see things that are in video as compared to still images, the stickiness to our brain is greater. And the research that has been done on individuals who have been looking at internet pornography is compelling. As I mentioned, I've been part of 3 congressional briefings in the United States regarding the role of internet pornography and why we as a country should be trying to limit its easy access. One of my co-presenters at one of the briefings, Dr. Marianne Layden from the University of Baltimore, talked about how in her sexual addiction clinic, she would have so many men who would come in who had lost their jobs because they were looking at internet pornography at work, who didn't end up going to a job interview for a big position because in order to calm themselves down from the anxiety of going to the interview, they had to stop and look at internet pornography. She talked about how this has become one of the most important and salient problems that she sees in her sexual dysfunctions clinic. The book Pornified, which was written by Pamela Paul, talked about what is happening to young men under the age of 35 in America, at least, with respect to their dating behaviors. And what she found was that on a Gallup poll of numerous young men that she interviewed over a year's worth of research, she found that significant numbers stated, I don't date anymore. Why do I need to date? I can just go online and look at pornography and become sexually satisfied. I don't need to spend the money. Well, this is what Gary Wilson has written about in his book, Your Brain on Porn, Internet Pornography and the Emerging Science of Addiction. We now know from looking at functional MRI studies that the same chemicals that are secreted by the brain when you use pornography are the same chemicals that the brain will secrete when you're using cocaine. The issue of addiction is not psychological, it is chemical. And it's worsened with respect to internet pornography because, unlike just looking at something and all that you are seeing, which is then coming into your mirror neuron function of your brain, is being continuously hijacked, is the terminology in the literature, by the response, your sexual response from your sexual organs. So you have two different body systems that are responding to one source, both of which can be addictive. Dr. Wilson's book, I would encourage you to read because they are blogs of people who have been looking at internet pornography and what it has done to them, to their relationships, and how they feel about themselves. And one of the things that Gary Wilson helped us to see, and TED Talks that he has are also very enlightening, was that internet pornography has become the leading cause of erectile dysfunction in men under 36. When you're under 36 and you have erectile dysfunction, it's usually not because you have an enlarged prostate or because you have high blood pressure or you have some other type of long-term chronic disorder. It comes from masturbatory behavior. And this is another dynamic that is relevant to the normalization of sexual harm, not just for children. It's the normalization of sexual harm for all of us. There is an organization called Fight the New Drug. It's a campaign that is really geared towards high school students because high school students are very much at risk for sexual addiction through internet pornography. Love is stronger than shame because many times when kids, both girls and boys, have become habituated to internet pornography, it's very hard for them to disclose that. When I'm talking to my parents in my practice, especially for my children who have high functioning autism spectrum disorder and are now for the first time sort of getting on social networking sites for the first time, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, I tell parents, you must be very careful about your child because your child has autism, they have pragmatic language problems and they tend to say things that social skills would teach them not to say. So therefore, they may hear something or see something on their social networking site and go to school and repeat that, thinking that that is the way to be accepted socially. And I intentionally and very carefully explain to parents that sexually explicit content, that's the terminology I use in my clinic so that the kids who are in there won't really know what I'm talking about. Sexually explicit content, particularly when it is when it's seen in a video format, can be exceedingly addictive, and it can be very exciting, and it will cause children, adults, and everybody else to come back to it. So the parent cannot put their children on autopilot as they might like to do. So this conversation is not just for adults. It's not just for those who are just turning 18. This is for parents of children as young as 5 and 6, because unfortunately, internet pornography is the sex education of the 21st century. I was invited to speak at a conference in Australia um, by their federal law enforcement agents. And they wanted me to come and talk a little bit about adolescent behavior and some of the things that they were seeing with respect to some of the problems they were having, just like all of these different examples I'm showing you. And when I got ready to come to speak, I said, and so in particular, is there a particular problem you're concerned about? He said, yes. What we are seeing in Australia is that one of the most common search titles for teenagers in Australia on Google is BDSM. BDSM. Wow. I said, sadomasochism. Okay. He said, how could teenagers be so interested in what started out as 50 Shades of Grey? But this is the dynamic of what our children are having to decipher and trying to figure out, is this what's normal? Is this what we should be thinking about? It's very challenging for them. On Google, it takes 0.13 seconds to open up the word porn, and you will have more than 1 billion sites that will be available. If you type in teen porn, 155 million. And if you type in healthy sexuality, 4 million results will come up. So I think you can see that we are up against some really challenging circumstances, if for no other reason than we recognize this situation. Sexual harm across the lifespan is relevant, unfortunately, to children who are being sexually abused. I have worked now for more than 15 years with our National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where parents can call in or type in or report evidence of child maltreatment, especially sexual abuse and exploitation. It is our hotline for our country. And those sexually abusive images, which we now call child sexual abuse material, we used to call it child pornography, but that's not the right term because the term pornography infers voluntary modeling and consent. Now that we recognize that's not the right term, pretty much around the world, the term CSAM, or child sexual abuse material, some countries refer to it as child sexual abuse images, is more appropriate. And what we know that out of the more than 150 million images that are in our database at our National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that have been turned in by law enforcement investigations and parents and other individuals who have reported and sent the URLs of abusive images that they've seen on the internet. Out of those more than 150 million images, 12% are of infants and toddlers who are being sexually abused. Preschool children who have been abused by adults or youth will then begin to exhibit what we refer to now as problematic sexual behaviors. We used to call that as youth sex offender behaviors. But in the United States, we're trying very hard to step away from that term, youth sex offender, because it's highly stigmatizing. And it infers that this is what you're going to be for the rest of your life, which we now know that with appropriate therapy, 30 sessions is what our research has shown, these children will have less than a 5% recidivism rate of problematic sexual behavior. Exposure to adult pornography by young children with coaching of mimicking of the behaviors that are on those explicit images results in mutual sexual contact among school-aged children, or excessive masturbatory behaviors will only cause our children to be reenacting behaviors that can only cause harm for them in society. The first time that a child has been looking at adult pornography with an older adolescent sibling or a young adult in the household, and then goes for a sleepover to some other child's house and begins to imitate the behaviors that they have seen, or encourages another child to, let's see if we can go online and find this kind of material, which isn't hard to find at all, is the time when your child, that child who behaves that way, will be seen as a pariah. The parents may discipline the child terribly, but that's not the point. The point is this child has been exposed to what is sexually harmful material for that child's age range. Preteen sexual harm within the context of offline or online gaming, resulting in the assumption of guilt by the victim because of losing, is another way that we are seeing older children sexually assault younger children. They will play a video game with a younger child. The older child obviously has much more capability. They win. And then they tell the younger child, okay, you have to unzip your pants because you lost. And in my patients who've come to my clinic under those circumstances, when they come to my clinic having been brought in as having been sexual assault victims by an adolescent, for example, they come into my office saying to me, it's all my fault. And I will say, why is it your fault? And they will say, because I lost. If I had been smarter, if I had learned how to do this better, I wouldn't have had to go through this. I wouldn't have had to take my pants down. So we are in a real challenging world. This is a clipping from a newspaper article of two 13-year-old boys videotaping themselves sexually assaulting a 5-year-old girl and recording sexual contact between her and two other young children. If you look at the bottom of this clip, it shows what the tape showed. It shows the boys assaulting the girl with an object, and she's also seen having sexual contact with another 5-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Where did these children learn this? But more importantly, where did they learn to record it? They learned it from video things. This is a scene from a court case that I testified in involving two doctors who were grooming their patients as preteens into sexual contact, into giving in to sexual contact with the doctors. The doctors would select their patients who were coming from families where there was a lot of dysfunction in their homes, and they would convince the boys that they should allow the doctors to have sexual contact with them. And in return, they would give these 10, 11, 12-year-old boys money to give to their moms so that it would help the family. So these poor boys had to go along with this because they felt that this is how they could help their family. The two doctors, as you can see, sitting at the table were pediatricians, and they were twin brothers. And it was really a compelling case that I was involved in because they had hundreds of victims that they had shown abusive images. I shouldn't say they were abusive because they were not child abusive images. They were adult pornography images, but convinced these boys that this is what they needed to do. Normalized sexual harm is often in the family, intrafamilial, and grooming is a common next step. This particular cartoon that I'm showing you, you don't have to read, but it was written by a father talking to his daughter. And he is explaining to her in this cartoon why having sex with his daughter was a really reasonable thing to do, and that other people would vilify them if they knew that they were having sex. One of the things that he writes in this homemade cartoon to his daughter is, by the way, I did not mind that time you put your hand down my underwear. I loved you very much at that moment. The point is that the little girl that he has written into his own cartoon is having concerns about, is this all right? And he is explaining to her in his own way how this is a normal relationship between a father and a daughter. I remember a case in Germany where two stepsons were shown adult pornography by their stepfather, each when they turned 11 or 12 years of age. Some fathers might feel that this is the way to help their sons grow up and become men. But in this particular case, that stepfather was grooming these boys into becoming willing participants in sexual contact between each other, and then allowing the stepfather to sexually abuse them. So when we see kids who are being shown adult pornography by adults, we need to be thinking, why is that? It's not necessarily because an adult is trying to help them know what they need to know. It can make girls or boys not be sure about what is going on. And it makes it hard for them to be able to come forward and explain to us what is happening to them. Sexual harm across the lifespan also can entail exposure to an online offender who pays a trafficker to coerce sexual behaviors on demand by young children who are victims of sex tourism. Adolescent relationship abuse, which we used to call teen dating violence, resulting in the power and control dynamics of an intimate partner violence situation, inclusive of sexual assault, all of this with verbal and digital sexual bullying and rape. All of these are dynamics that can be very harmful over the lifespan. And grooming through the use of information and communication technology can cause children to become what we refer to as compliant victims, then sending self-generated images or sexting or sexually explicit chat. And they are at great risk if they have been groomed through someone's cell phone or someone's tablet. They have been recruited, transported, harbored, or have been directed or influenced over the movements of a child or an adolescent for the purpose of exploitation, and typically sexual exploitation. If you do not know about um, the animated, computer animated image called Tweety, please look that up on YouTube. This was a digital Filipino child, digital, that the nonprofit organization Ter des Hommes in the Netherlands put together in order to put online and to see how many men would listen to her saying that she wants to be their friend, and how many men would want to try to find her to have sex with her. And they turned over credit card information from hundreds of men who saw this animated character whom they thought was a real Filipino girl. Um, they wanted to be able to have sex with her, and they were sending their credit card information to her. But that was the tip of the iceberg, because right now in the Philippines, we are seeing significant amounts of pay for view sexual exploitation of very young children. Individuals from Canada, the United States, Europe, etc., are using Bitcoins, PayPal, other third-party payment means in order to log on their computer in their country of origin to a trafficker in the Philippines who is making very young children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, sit in front of a computer while the offender is on the other end of that computer, having now paid money and directing the children to perform different types of sexual acts. Many times these children will be 2 or 3 in a group, and the buyer will be encouraging them to have sexual contact with each other to satisfy their sexual proclivities. This is very compelling. And if you would like more information, I would recommend that you just web search online sexual exploitation Philippines, and you will see their most recent report regarding how this is dramatically rising since they began to follow, track, and study this in 2013. The normalization of sexual harm in teen dating violence is another dynamic that we have to think about. In fact, there is going to be a conference here in the United States in a couple of weeks. And one of the sessions that is going to be focused on strangulation is entitled The Sexualization of Strangulation. After the movie and the book 50 Shades of Grey and other kinds of indications of the whole role of domination, we are seeing more teen dating violence. And so the organization Love Is Not Abuse has many significant and helpful recommendations that you can look up online, and start a group in a high school or a middle school to discuss why love is not abuse. Adolescent relationship abuse is often a manifestation of the normalization of sexual harm. And that sexual harm can also become digitized. Digitizing abuse through harassment through technology is extraordinary. And I am now continuing to have to testify in more and more cases where there is extortion through chat, online chat, through online dating sites. Some of the statements that you can see in this village, the Mall of Tomorrow says, "You are why are you Facebook friends with him? I want you to delete him now, or it's not going to be good." A threat. "You should send me a naked pic." Or, "I don't care if you want to see me or not. I want to see you tonight." A lot of power and control that is being communicated just through chat. And I'm having to help lawyers and judges and other systems to understand that when a young girl or a young boy gets sexually assaulted under these circumstances, they feel absolutely threatened by these individuals, even though for you and I, this would be seen as just chat and we would want to just delete it. So I think that it's very relevant and important for us to continue thinking about this. Love is not abuse, and information, brochures on domestic and dating violence against lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women are really important. And this has been picked up by the European Union um, as well, not just in the United States. Then I want to also mention sextortion. Sextortion is the use of blackmail in order to have a person be present and to do what they want. This usually entails the implantation of spyware into a teenager, for example's computer without their knowing. It can easily have been done by going and looking at a YouTube video or chat or opening a communication that they don't really recognize, and now the software has been placed onto their computer. And then the individual who's watching that teenager is able to video record everything they do in their bedroom, and then show the teenager that they have naked pictures of them. They have very compromising pictures of them. And so sextortion is the self-production of images in response to blackmail that previous images already exist and will be circulated if the victim doesn't comply. The end results are the production of abusive images, sometimes called child pornography, but we would call it abusive child sexual abuse material. It's a sexual crime with no hands-on contact, and the long-term victim impact is truly profound. One of the biggest cases, and I would encourage you to look this person up, Lucas Chancellor, was out of the Netherlands, an individual who had sextorted more than 300 teenage girls in multiple countries. And he was simultaneously chatting, typing to them that he was able to have images of them. So this normalization of sexual harm is also within the context of sex trafficking. One of my patients, B, was an unhappy 13-year-old being raised by her grandmother, whom she felt was too strict. And so she was talking about this in her Facebook page. And one of her friends kind of shared her moaning and groaning to an older teen friend, and he offered to come to her grandmother's house. He went there, and she had developed digital contact with him, thinking that he was a really good guy. So he came to pick her up one afternoon just to take her out for a little bit while her grandmother was napping, and her family didn't see her again for almost a month. She was sold by traffickers and groomed out of her home through Facebook. When you go into a store and you see children's underwear that says, "Who needs credit cards?" that's a normalization of sexual harm. Human Trafficking 201, this is just last month on the Teen Violence Dating Awareness Month. Did you know that 55% of child sex trafficking victims reportedly met their traffickers online? And so this was a session to be able to help kids understand, especially teenagers, how child traffickers recruit and how can they be safe. Sex traffickers love technology too. They are now recruiting the next gen sex buyers, and they are selling kids for money. I must tell you that I must testify at least 4, 5, or 6 times a year in sex trafficking cases. And being groomed online is not an uncommon way in which young girls or boys are brought into victimization. And if they're not groomed online, they are most assuredly sold online. So that an individual can go into an online classified ad and say exactly what he wants. And the trafficker will have the child delivered to their hotel room, or they will come and see the child themselves. This is an example from Tinder, an online dating site. Here is the victim who, as you can see in the next picture in the middle, now has a tattoo across her chest. You can see in the third picture how her face is swollen, her eyes are becoming um, dark and shadowed. The next picture, the evidence of physical battering, that is the rule more so than the exception in the life of a trafficking victim. Sex trafficking victims have no options. You have the option to help end it now. I really appreciate this particular campaign out of Ireland as they try to talk about the role of technology and the normalization of sexual harm that we see with respect to victims of sex trafficking. I want to also speak about the fact that schools can have and counties can have um, a campaign on choosing respect. Choose respect is a specific um, prevention strategy by the Centers for Disease Control and Injury Prevention here in the United States, the CDC. And its goal is to try to help boys and girls to understand that a relationship should be one of respect, not one of harm, not one of danger. The Choose Respect campaign is really an important one. It also has some images such as these, where you have kids who are not always seen as the perfect size 5 kind of individual, but in fact, kids of all shapes and sizes. This guy says, I'm going to tell the guys she couldn't keep her hands off me. But then what he really is going to say is, I'm going to tell the guys she's cool to be with. Choose respect is a much better way to have a relationship. And it's hard sometimes because when we live in a society where sexual harm is normalized, it's like swimming upstream. We have to be proactive in pushing this message. Choose respect for girls or boys that you want to be with, partners that you want to have. Choose respect. Don't try to be the one who's going to be the dominant person. Montgomery County in Maryland has activities for their middle school and high school students in order to try to encourage them to look for opportunities to choose respect and to decrease the amount of relationship abuse. And in doing so, they are taking away another aspect of that normalization of sexual harm. So I want to summarize the things that I've been talking about today by encouraging us all to be thinking about sexual harm. I had an event one time that my company decided to sponsor an event for girls, and it was called a Girls' Day. And we had an entire day at a local recreational activity center and invited only girls. We had 200 girls that we invited. Many of them were from foster care settings. Some of them were from orphanages. Many of them were girls from the communities, Girl Scout troops, etc. And the purpose of this whole gathering was to honor these girls, make them feel good about themselves, and also help them understand that their value wasn't only going to have to be in their sexuality. So one of the things that I decided to do was I chose maybe 10 girls before the event. I spent $70 on popular magazines, and I brought these 10 girls into a room with a computer printer, a laptop, and their knowledge on PowerPoint. And I asked them to go through these randomly selected 10 magazines and cut out advertisements that showed healthy sexual messages versus unhealthy sexual messages. And at first, the girls were like, What? What are you talking about? But then they began to see what I was talking about, and they really got into it, especially some of the advertisements for things like um, a razor that you might shave your legs with, for which the razor was just one little tiny image in the whole picture. The rest of the picture was J-Lo with something very, very sexualized and very, very almost over the top. And the girls would say, why do they have to do this in order to advertise a razor? The same thing with milk, food products, sex sells. And I wanted them to understand that. So they cut out all these different pictures. They embedded them into a PowerPoint presentation. And during the girls' day at lunchtime, while everybody with 200 people were eating lunch, these girls got up and gave their own PowerPoint presentation talking about the normalization of sexual harm in advertising of food, in advertising of cosmetics, in advertising of movies. They were on it. And I found that to be a great way to be able to bring children and adolescents into giving the message, because as we know, youth will listen to youth a whole lot more than they will listen to us. Well, let me now give us a few minutes for questions that you may have. And the reason that I end with this particular slide is because what we see is what will get us. And therefore, we have to be on the lookout to be aware and to try to help our children not be caught in the normalization of sexual harm. Let me now share the screen so that if you have any questions, you can certainly please pose them to me. I'm very happy to be able to respond to that. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we have about 4 minutes before we'll be cut off. So please do let me know if there are any questions. I think I have to stop sharing my screen, or I'll ask Raul to do that for me. This is my email address in case you would like to get in touch with me, and I'm very happy to be able to let you know if there's anything that I can answer that wasn't clear. Oh, thank you. I am seeing really nice comments. I certainly do appreciate that. Questions go here. If there are any questions, I would I see one of the questions. One thing I would say, don't just allow sexual harm to go unnoticed. If you're in a youth serving organization with a school system, in a faith-based community, bring it up for conversation, because we have to be proactive in giving alternate messages so that our children will not fall prey to advertising, to music videos, to manga books. Boy, those are a big deal. To the sexualization in movies. There are a lot of dynamics that we have to try to go against. How do we decrease the impacts of teen dating violence? That has been studied in New York. And what they recommend is having groups of students twice a month or so in a high school setting to get up and talk to another group on how to be safe, how to choose respect. A teacher can start the conversation with, we just heard about this in the news. How could this have been prevented? Having open discussion, super important. And boy, video games, I saw that someone else mentioned video games, very important. Grand Theft Auto really was a bad thing because it had scenes in it where if you wanted to win, you would have sex with a prostituted woman, get out of the car, and then beat her up and take your money back. So keeping aware of what our children are playing is another important piece for us to be able to stay on top of this normalization of sexual harm. So nice to see such lovely comments. I certainly do appreciate that, and I hope it's helpful information for all of us. Me as a pediatrician, as you might imagine, I bring this up all the time with my families and my patients. Seize the moment and say the best that you can say. Yes, I appreciate that. A comment about mirror neurons itself. That, oh man, that's changed the way I think, and I try to let other people know as well. Perfect. The Radius Child and Youth Services website. on Youth Dating Violence Program. Outstanding. Thank you all so much for your attention. Think we've gotten everybody that we could at this point. Oh, okay, we have one more minute. So I wanted to just make sure um, that this is helpful information. And thank you all for your positive responses. It's been a privilege to be able to share with you.